accident fire. In her yard in Brewster, her daughter came home from a party and found her. Same way as my uncle, who was her grandfather. An aerosol can blew up in the trash. Goddamn, what were the odds? She was just getting ready to go to her midnight shift as an RN in Wadsworth, and she vanished up in flames like that. But there had to be more to her life's worth. Everyone's grieving out of their minds, making arrangements and taking drugs. But I'm flying out there tomorrow because I need to give and get some hugs. 'Cause I got questions that I'd like to get answered. I may never get them, but Chris, I gotta know, how did it happen? Chris, who is 35, you don't just raise 2 kids and take out your trash and die. She was my second cousin, I didn't know her well at all, but it don't mean that I wasn't meant to find some poetry, to make some sense of this, to find a deeper meaning.
This sermon is not going to be inspiring. This sermon is not going to make you think about the magic of being human or the power of love or the beauty of acceptance. I'm going to make you angry and depressed because those are the reactions that humans have when the mask is taken off and they are exposed for what they truly are. Today, Sunday, all over the world and in the past, sermons would warn humans of the cost of transgressing against God. They would enforce arbitrary laws and social standards. This was a type of technology. The fear of punishment, the promise of rewards, and the specter of the constant surveillance of God to bolster cooperation and tribal identity. Our ability to control human behavior has not evolved much from promising fire and brimstone, from threatening that sinners will be throttled at the hands of an angry God. We are animals. We shit and breathe and eat and fuck. We are machines that shit and eat and breathe and fuck, built by evolution to replicate copies of code within ourselves. Not for any divine reason, but because we are the product of millions of years of this code replicating. The code doesn't know where it's going or why. It doesn't perpetuate virtue or kindness or truth, other than as a means to the end of making more copies of itself. The code is selfish, because only selfish code survived. Darwin, praise be unto him, said the earth was filled with endless forms most beautiful, and the process that makes these endless forms beautiful and ugly, cruel and virtuous, the evolutionary process that created every animal and our much celebrated human minds, was a process of death and luck, striving and suffering, superiority, inequality, and the remorseless process that culled over and over again any ineffective meat machine that did not replicate its code. We are machines to perpetuate code. We are machines to perpetuate code. We are machines to perpetuate code. How could a machine to perpetuate code ever be the author of itself? How could it change fundamentally by imagining itself to be anything else? How can we change fundamentally by deceiving ourselves that we are not animals, that we are not a combination of our genes and environment, that we can author ourselves, that we can surpass everything that makes us exactly what we are? We have robots on Mars. We have artificial wombs. We can photograph black holes. And tomorrow I'm going to fly over 17,000 kilometers in one day. But there is no effective technology of human behavior being used to improve the human condition. Where there is a technology of behavior, we use it to encourage people to buy makeup, to spend as much time on social media as possible, and to eat as much fatty, sweet, and starchy food as their stomach can possibly handle, rather than, say, writing a sermon for an audience well before you need to deliver it. Almost everywhere in the world, the pervasive problems are caused by lack of psychological technology. Doctors recommend unnecessary surgery in America. Albinos in Malawi are killed for their body parts. People eat and drink and drug themselves to death all over the world, and we are nearly as powerless as our distant ancestors sitting around a fire. Most ideas about the workings of the universe from the ancient world are now defunct, except in the realm of the human mind. In ancient times, it was said that objects accelerated as they neared the ground because they became more jubilant. And projectiles had a characteristic called impetuosity that propelled them forward. B.F. Skinner, praise be unto him, noticed that the acceleration of technology that has enabled all the wonders we see in physics, in biology, and in engineering only progressed when we stopped attributing mental states to objects. Science progresses when we can predict what will happen, but we can't predict what humans will do because we keep asking them why they are doing what they are doing. Our sciences of human behavior are based on the lies we tell one another about ourselves. Our minds are rife with deception towards ourselves and one another. We understand objects because we do not ask them why they do what they do. We can understand and predict that a sow will nurse her baby, her piglets, why stags lock horns, why male mallards rape females, and why a rat cannot learn to sing opera, because we cannot ask these animals why they do what they do, and because they do not resist control. Our minds are divided and not unitary, and we have based our science of human behavior on the lies that we tell in our minds and outside of them. Imagine a nation that has hundreds of employees in its government, number crunchers, spies, brief writers, cleaning staff, and administrators. But this government only has one press secretary, whose job it is to represent the actions of that government in the most virtuous, positive, and coherent light. The press secretary does not know about the workings of the propaganda wing of the government, the foreign leaders that have been assassinated, or the way the revenue numbers have been calculated. The press secretary just delivers propaganda as she hears it. Our conscious awareness of our actions are simply a press secretary, and yet we still privilege her information as if it is the very best possible source. We do not write our own programming, and we cannot convey it with any fidelity. We are machines to propagate code, and very rarely, if ever, does our code get propagated more effectively if we honestly communicate our true motives, even if we had access to them in order to communicate them. Throughout our evolutionary history, we competed with other humans for resources, for mates, for the chance to propagate our stupid code over and over again into the future. So it goes. Rarely, if ever, was communicating honestly about our intentions and in a way that other people could fully predict the best way of getting our code propagated better. But it was also in our best interest to be able to predict the behavior of others, to track them, to use all the pleasure and punishment we could summon, to recruit others to perpetuate our code over anyone else's, to help us to survive and reproduce, to give us whatever we could get them to offer through kindness, deception, allure, aggression, and pity. The tools are profligate when the ends are the same. Proteus is a shape-shifting god who will tell you the future if only you can capture him. We are all endeavoring to be Proteus. You can predict our behavior if only you can see the pattern in our shifting explanations and our planned unpredictability. Our minds are protean. In order to evade capture, it is in our nature to try to avoid understanding, to avoid predictability by others, especially those that wish to control us, which happens to be almost everyone else. How can a machine that cannot interrogate its own programming, that only knows the output of any particular program that is currently running, ever be honest? All of us are simpler, more selfish, more animal, more deceptive, and more Machiavellian than we could possibly understand or convey, because our identities are curated to broadcast, not to be an honest and authentic representation. We do not author ourselves. We merely author the stories that we tell to others. In this dark and dangerous thoughts, we have been scrutinizing identity and identity politics, the newest tools of the arsenal to evade control. In the current era, our notion of identity is inconsistent, schizophrenic, And ethnic identity certainly doesn't mean you would differ biologically, and it would be offensive to predict that they would be more likely to have certain interests, priorities, or cognitive styles. All the evidence, though, points to the idea that stereotypes continue because they are heuristics that themselves have predictive power. When we rail against stereotypes, we are railing against prediction. We are railing against control. We can predict with 95% accuracy whether someone is male or female on the basis of the quantification of their personality, or their dating preferences, or indeed, even with a brain scan. And yet predicting what interests or personality or occupation someone might be interested in on the basis of whether they are male or female is strongly discouraged and punished. Every step we make in better predicting human behavior is eroded by the devaluation of experts and objective evidence. Identity is not expertise, and yet we treat it as such. Definitions of identity, man, woman, all of the identity definitions that we use are constantly fluid, and they are eroding at the foundation of objective knowledge about human nature and behavior. In this current era, IQ is one of the most accurate and psychological predictors available. It's a measure of intelligence. It's maligned, and it's illegal to use in hiring or even to talk about in polite company. Yet graphology, the totally unscientific analysis of handwriting that can predict nothing, is used in many developed countries and in many companies. Public intellectuals who malign IQ as a means to an end of improving the technology of behavior speak about intersectionality, toxic masculinity, trauma, microaggressions, and implicit bias, as if they were obviously real concepts. Nebulous definitions and even more dubious potential applications are rife in our explanation of human behavior and in the applications we try to apply to it. We cannot alleviate human suffering on this shifting and fluid foundation. As if the erosion of hard concepts and understanding human psychology wasn't enough, the investigation of human nature is now fraught with roadblocks in the name of ethics. While social media companies steal hours of people's lives, essentially the same as dying earlier, it could be impossible to discover an enduring feature of human psychology that could help millions if it would even cause distress to 10 people. All the problems that the left and the right lament can only be solved by an understanding of human behavior and a willingness to exercise control. We live in a deterministic universe, and if humans are to be an object of scientific study, their behavior must also be determined. Physics could not have progressed. We could not have built everything that we see around us if objects could decide whether or not they were subject to gravity at any given moment. In studies in the last few decades, we have found that with simple food reinforcement, you can train a pigeon to distinguish Mondrian from Van Gogh. You can train a rat to signal whether or not they were sure or unsure about a decision that they made. And you can train a fish to use their creativity to interact in new ways with a rubber band in each iteration. This is called operant conditioning. And you can use an operant conditioning chamber or a Skinner box in order to train animals to do things that they could not even imagine being able to do. And yet, none of us own a Skinner box. None of us own an operant conditioning chamber, regardless of what we want to change about ourselves. The only time you've probably ever seen a human being similarly treated would be in Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, where a violent criminal is rendered physically incapable of committing crimes with films and nauseating drugs. Alex, the anti-hero of A Clockwork Orange, is a psychopath, and psychopathy is predominantly determined by genetic factors. And psychopathy is just a form of control used by genes to get into the next generation at the expense of the suffering of other people. And yet when Alex, the psychopath, is controlled, when he is rendered incapable of inflicting suffering on other people, we are ethically ambivalent about his newfound lawlessness, simply because the psychopathy arrived first and the training came later. We are a conglomeration of factors, mostly genetic, and otherwise the residue of the manipulation of others on our behavior and personality. And yet we want to be ourselves and resist control, even when it is in our best interests. We are machines programmed to perpetuate our genes into the next generation. And yet we identify strongly with what we are now and resist even the understanding that could enable us to be better. So we are deluded about what we are So what is the cost? One of the enduring mysteries of the universe is something that's called the Fermi paradox. Essentially, why have we encountered no other intelligent life? Why have we not ever communicated with intelligent aliens? And for decades, philosophers and scientists have been pondering this puzzle. What could be killing off these civilizations that we might have interacted with? What could be stifling their ability to communicate with us? Maybe all these aliens got addicted to their own form of Twitter or social media or video games. Maybe they're all having sex with sex robots. Maybe they all died of plague. Maybe they all died of nanobots or nuclear war. How can we avoid the total extinction that seems to be most common? How can we avoid non-existence that is common in advanced civilizations? Right now, our ability to make weapons or synthesize diseases far surpasses our ability to control human behavior. In a short time, we will face the prospect of a concept called ambivalence, the ability of any one individual to wipe out all of civilization in a few easy steps. Every 10 years, you can destroy all of civilization, even if you're 10 IQ points dumber. How will we manage the threat of our destruction when we cannot even agree on which ideologies are most harmful, aggressive, or radicalizing? When we will not even preferentially screen young men who are the most prone to terrorism in airports over women with small children? How can we avoid our destruction when we are so attached to our animal programming, our amoral evolutionary instincts, the people we were born and raised as, and ideas of freedom, dignity, and free will? Well, I thought about ending here, but despite everything I said, I actually do want you guys to like me. So rather than just preventing the imminent collapse and destruction of all of civilization, I thought I might also present the best case scenario, even though I think it's profoundly unlikely. The best case scenario of taking on my thesis that we have to embrace control. Evolution, the process that crafted our intelligence and all our vices and virtues, would never pass an ethics review, nor would implanting people with anxiety disorders, depression, and the desire to hurt others. Yet we are irrationally attached to who we are, even if it makes us and others suffer. In one study, participants were asked if they would take a pill to enhance various abilities. Over half of participants said they would take a pill to enhance their rote memory, their language learning, or ability to concentrate, but less than 10% said they would take a pill that would make them kinder. Philosopher David Pearce, peace be upon him, has said, "Too many of our preferences reflect nasty behaviors and states of mind that were genetically adaptive in the ancestral environment. Instead, wouldn't it be better if we rewrote our own corrupt code? And yet, if someone is just genetically altered to be immune to HIV, people find that morally troubling. When people are born in the lottery of genetics every day who have pervasive anxiety and depression. Right now, we are not the authors of ourselves. We catch glimmers of bliss in the arms of our lovers, in the eyes of our children, and between bouts of self-doubt, anxiety, and depression. If we became less attached to what we are now, if we could embrace the technology of control and the understanding of human psychology, we could fundamentally change ourselves." Philosopher Nick Bostrom wrote a beautiful piece, which is called Letter from Utopia. And one thing that's diminishing or limiting about our human psychology is our inability to actually think about the far future, think about what the far future could be like. People talk about privilege a lot, but the people that could exist in the future have no vote. They have no say. They want to exist as we all exist. So in Nick Bostrom's Letter from Utopia, he tries to give voice to these people in the future. He tries to convey what one of them might say to us, people who could possibly exist if we got everything right, people who could exist if we embrace the technology of human behavior. And this future person writes, "You could say I'm happy, that I feel good. You could say that I feel surpassing bliss. But these are words invented to describe human experience. What I feel is far beyond human feelings, as my thoughts are beyond human thoughts. I wish I could show you what I have in mind. If only I could share 1 second of my conscious life with you. In order to find utopia, to find a blissful future, we have to relinquish our attachment to what we are now, to how we understand ourselves, to how we embrace prediction and control. If we are to become genius rats, we have to live in a cage for a while. And if we are to become angels, we must know how wings work. Thank you.